Άγιοι πατέρες, αγαπητοί σύνεδροι.
Dear fathers, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, I wish to thank for the honor for this invitation, of course, and the scientific and organizing committee of this major conference, because it touches upon some crucial aspects related not just to the Greek society, but to say the global society. Now, the topic of my presentation, as you heard, is related, of course, to the so-called new culture, the so-called woke culture, and how this influences school and especially the course of religion. So the plethora of movements in today's world demands an inelastic ideology, which is a challenge for contemporary societies. Adopting political correctness and gender fluidity are some of the ideologies that tend to influence today's school and set questions and issues related to some important distinctions between the recognition of human rights and the imposition of an extreme entitlement. The concept of woke, as the previous speaker said, started in the 20th century as an expression of awakening against the social inequalities, especially in racial issues in the United States. Today, it has been evolved and it includes issues like gender equality, climate change, and the rights of the LGBT plus community. Woke agenda is actually a question of debate, fight, because its supporters see it as a new policy of awakening, whereas its critics believe that leads to some hyphen political correctness, which actually limits the liberty of speech. Beyond any doubt, the woke agenda or the awakening has changed the way that the education system needs to respond to these new trends. In this framework, education is invited to acknowledge these differences between students and reinforce understanding, empathy, and of course mutual respect. Needless to say that sometimes this actually leads to a great progressive approach which can be conflictual against some universal values and assumptions. These changes have provoked a lot of discussions and dilemmas as far as how these should be or not introduced, such social issues, in the educational process. Now, the so-called politics and agenda of woke is not just such a new thing of the so-called self-consciousness as a previous speaker. It's been a century ago that postmodernism, as a philosophical and of course cultural movement, influenced today's societies. And it also influenced contemporary movements in the different dimensions and via different consequences. Postmodernism erupted back in the 20th century as a philosophical and cultural movement, which actually is there to negate the great narratives and the absolute truths by talking to relativity and, of course, cultural identity. According to Lyotard, the postmodern situation is characterized by the fragmentation of traditional knowledge in various narratives and approaches. Postmodernism introduced in our society concepts like the breakdown and, of course, putting into question institutional values and institutional powers. This influenced not just art and philosophy, but also social movements, contributing to the recognition of some marginalized voice and identities. These two movements, woke movement and postmodernism, are interconnected through the critique they exercise on some traditional values and structures. Postmodernism set the limits to discuss issue of identity and cultural diversity, which are major issues of the woke agenda. Still, a handful of researchers, they do say that woke agenda tends to work dogmatically and not focusing to the open discussion, which is a central value of postmodernism. Beyond any doubt, these new movements tend to lead to a new reality, which is characterized by pluralism, which is rather radical, by insisting on the importance of difference and diversity, which at the same time leads to the total affirmation of difference in all the dimensions of life. The discussion and the debate of pedagogy within these new movements led to an initial refusal because this seemed to lead to the end of collective values and will not lead to the actual important change, which is social change. Lenzen supports that postmodernism renders worthless the principles of pedagogy as it leads to the vanishing of important values and meaning attributing. So this regulatory, I dare to say, incohesion leads the pedagogy to be in a certain confusion. Now, the meeting of pedagogy with these new movements had also some positive aspects, as of course is the sensibilization and the value of diversity and the development of intercultural consciousness and education. These assumptions led pedagogy to better understand the importance of emotional intelligence, of empathy, the problematic against contemporary issues like green transition, technocracy, and the consequences on the evolution of our world. Beyond any doubt, pluralism of postmodern societies can also offer a greater way to discuss issues, but under the condition that we do not create some important communities and societies that accept everything and also negate everything, because as Ioanna would say, pluralism will lead to a so-called relativistic nihilism in so-called parallel monologues. The absolutization of pluralism leads to be antisocial, and it's not a sustainable solution to any of the people's problem. Mythologizing diversity, according to Postman, leads to privatization of thought and renders incompetent a common base of understanding. Postman tries to explain the crisis of our educational system as a failure to help and equip our students with an inclusive narrative, as it was mentioned previously. Against all of the above, today's school lead to utilitarianism, to consumerism, and to a feeling of worriness, to a feeling of rage. Now, we need to identify in some other strategies, like, for example, the healthy spiritual skepticism, the respect of traditions, the appreciation of diversity, but under common principle logic, which is much needed than ever before. Postman, in his book, The End of Education, invites us to rethink why in education and not just how, and also propose some practical ways to reform the education system on the basis of narratives that could actually will be able to lead to social unity. Despite the data of biomedical and anthropological conclusions, these new movements did not understand, did not accept the changes as far as human nature. Del Costadis will insist that it seems that they are celebrating as a triumph and as a eulogy this Babylonian confusion. So we're talking about a new Babel. We talk an overestimation of human capacities of communication in a greater and general confusion. We're talking about the apotheosis of fragmentation against the general. We talk about the fragmentation against the ecumenical values. He also says that the culture of this imbalance, we tend us to neglect and put away institutions like tradition, like religion, and we create a new ethics which is based on consumerism. And he says that in contemporary pedagogy, we do not have the anthropological thinking, and we tend to reproduce this anthropological confusion. Today, education needs to reconnect itself with some important anthropological questions by offering a new change. Along with Postman, we need to understand whether the future is all about figures, facts, technology, and technopoles. So, if these extremities in this so-called sociological phase that we face, where we have a privatization of life and the shrinking of life in the fight for money, we need to understand whether this is going to destroy education as a pole of transferring values and creativity. So we need to find an identity which will not be new fundamentalism and new narratives of a so-called negative globalization. Pedagogy needs to try to understand this anthropological orientation and have a stable discourse against the so-called self-reproduced division in this so-called biased autonomy. Education needs to find its roots in its anthropological diversion against the old assumptions, where we had, as Vajra said, a new stable life. It sees that young people, and especially young students, need to face many differences, many new problems. Postman refers to the vanishing of child life, which is threatened by contemporary technological means. We, to continue his thinking, when we talk about the fear even of a greater shrinkage of young age, we need to understand whether the choices as far as sexual identity and the relative information right from school about the capacity of many different sexual orientations, sexual choices, is the appropriate environment to develop and protect child and childhood. One of the major challenges that the woke agenda proposes is the trend to limit human identity in some social characteristics like gender or also social position or race. Against that, we need to understand that religious education promotes a more holistic understanding of human nature. This offers the capacity to students to understand the different aspects of their identity as it comes from the teaching which talk about the relation of human with God, society, and with himself. So this holistic way of thinking can actually operate as a counterbalance in this woke culture to underline the incorporation of some fragmented identities. Beyond any doubt, the acceptance and the harmonious coexistence with differentiation and diversity is, of course, a way that we can furthermore live altogether peacefully. But such an acceptance cannot operate positively when we do not have the appropriate values, which relies on some common shared values. In the name of the affirmation of the difference, we tend to mythologize the value of personal choices and we leave the liberty being destroyed. Boyd talks about the love of the accepted and talks about the domination of feminism. So in the text, Mount Athos and Education, we talk about the love of openness, the love of an ecumenical person, a person who is not egocentric and wishes to become even greater. Now, education, instead of reinforcing the course of people towards liberty, well, we tend to be limited right now, and it is a pedagogy which is incorrect, and it is an historic and anthropological, I dare to say, failure. So the school religious course against the challenge it needs to face against the changes in the religious environment, it needs to save the anthropological orientation of today's school as far as identifying a meaning in life. Now, in the era of great anthropological and ethical dilemmas, the school religious discourse should be a witness of truth and liberty. The orientation should actually promote dialogue and healthy skepticism by achieving a great balance between progress and the ideologies that are not the ones which one should expect. Now, the course religion should not be limited to talk just about the importance of religious feelings. In an era where the existential gap does exist due to the chaos of information from policies which reinforce this anthropological confusion with the diverse proposals of life, school religious course in the curriculum should be an anthropological pole of stability and a vital part of our life and evolution of humans. In today's historical conditions, school religion should actually be able to have a critical thinking as far as issues as violation of human rights and reinforce such a discourse in order to protect and better understanding of the importance of human rights. We need to help people to better understand, especially at school, the importance of diversity to be part of society and, of course, part of nature. But in an era of major anthropological dilemmas, religion should actually dictate and should actually explain and should actually educate people, especially students, as refer to the importance of this great thesaurus of universal truths. Against this trend of woke culture, religion should actually refer to the fragmented identities which should go out of the question and need to have a new way of having a proposal of life and liberty. To conclude, I would like to say that in the beginning of this millennium, when the different experimentation of people are intensified, we, as pedagogists, are responsible as new pedagogues, have a self-critique and say, what didn't I do correct? What should I do differently? Thank you.